Tonight, forget about 100 years of industrial history. The Conservatives promise to be the party that will now stand up for the rights of the worker. They unveil a raft of new proposals, but what does it actually mean for the national living wage? Will it reach £9 an hour by 2020?
It depends on what average earnings are, because what he said was that the national living wage should be 60% of the median
so
wage.
So if wages don't rise as much, will you fill that gap and make sure it gets to £9 an hour?
We've said we're aiming at 60%.
It's just been announced that Ian Brady's died. Is that the end of the story of the Moors murderers? Also tonight, whose fault is it the NHS got hit so hard by the ransomware virus?
There's a £5 billion backlog of maintenance for the NHS, and the IT budget has got to provide things like imaging equipment that make sure that cancer patients can be diagnosed. These are urgent and important demands on a very small budget.
And why is knife crime on the rise? We'll ask a former gang member. Hello, good evening. The Conservatives have initiated a series of practical measures to help workers today, or an audacious land grab on prime Labour real estate, depending on how you wish to see it. The Prime Minister pledges new protections for people in the gig economy, a right to training and measures to protect workers' rights after Brexit. But today, the Tories refuse to confirm the national living wage would reach £9 an hour by 2020, as George Osborne had previously announced. Our political editor, Nick Watt, is with us. Big moment for Theresa May, this. How did it play?
Yes, it was a really big moment for her. I've been making a film, tried to identify about how Theresa May wants to sort of refashion one nation Conservative to her vision of how this country should be run. And workers' rights is absolutely the heart of that. And the reason for that is one of her fundamental insights from Brexit was that it wasn't just a vote to leave the EU. It was a cry of anguish from people who feel left behind by globalisation. So these pledges today are designed by her to show that she really means business about making globalisation work for those people who feel left behind. But interestingly, she needs a mandate on this to face down critics in her own party. For example, she lost a battle in the cabinet in the autumn about getting workers sitting on company boards. One cabinet minister said to her, that idea in Germany didn't stop the Volkswagen diesel scandal. Now, that idea about workers' representation, it comes back, although the language and the wording about who will actually sit on those boards is not too clear.
Nick, thanks. Well, we'll see Nick's take on One Nation Conservatism in a moment, but first to that interview now with Damien Green, Work and Pension Secretary. I asked why the Tories were looking for this major shift of emphasis as the party of the worker, and he explained it was partly as a result of Brexit.
There were too many people who felt that the system didn't give them a fair crack of the whip. And Theresa May has made clear since she went into Downing Street that making this a country that works for everyone is key to her. And a large part of that is making sure that everyone benefits from a rising tide of prosperity.
There will be viewers sitting at home saying this is, quite frankly, laughable, that the Conservatives are trying to pitch themselves as the party of workers' right. The government that tried to bring in anti-strike laws, the government that saw a huge increase in zero-hours contracts and attempted to shut down trade unions. You're not going to get away with this.
Well, this government hasn't tried to shut down trade unions. Trade unions have a role to play, but people who think that making strikes more difficult is in any way anti-worker or anti-ordinary people are, I just think, wrong about that.
Zero-hours contracts?
I think zero-hours contracts, the percentage of people on zero-hours contracts who are happy to have them is about 70. Less than 3% of the workforce is on a zero-hours contract. The average amount of time worked by somebody on a zero-hours contract is 25 hours. So actually, they're rather popular with the people who are on them.
My point is, you can correct the percentage that you don't care about workers' rights really simply. You end the public sector pay pinch. You know that you have nurses who are about to go on strike over their 1% pay rise. For the first time in 100 years, you know you have public sector workers who are feeling the squeeze and that wages are stagnant. That's the way to correct that perception.
Well, wages aren't stagnant. We've had to take difficult decisions about pay in the public sector. In fact, pay progression among nurses means that the average pay increase is 3%. But yes, of course, everyone is concerned. You know, nurses do a great job. We've got more nurses than ever before. But
you're short of 40,000 nurses. That suggests there is a problem for you with drawing people into the profession.
Well, there are still more people applying, and there are places for training and so on. So, and we have got thousands more nurses than there were in 2010. But there is a wider range of aspects to workers' rights than just pay. Pay has gone up particularly at the bottom end of the pay scale because of the introduction of the national living wage, which we're now pledged to keep increasing until 2022. Because of that, those at the bottom end of the pay scale have had particularly high pay rises. They've had an average of 6% over the last 2 years, as compared to inflation running at about 2%.
So let's look at the national living wage there. Will that be what George Osborne set out as Chancellor, £9 an hour by 2020?
It will be. We're doing it on the basis of the suggested projection by George Bain, who used to run the low pay unit.
Will it reach £9 an hour by 2020?
It depends on what average earnings are, because what he said was that the national living wage should be 60% of the median
so
wage,
if wages
you like.
don't rise as much, will you fill that gap and make sure it gets to £9 an hour?
We've said we're aiming at 60%. It's below 60% now, so this will guarantee an increase over the coming years. Exactly how far it goes, I mean, the projection
so
is
it might not get to
somewhere around
£9
there.
an hour.
Well,
I mean, that's something you have to
We'll see.
accept.
It will go up. We're aiming at 60% of median wages, so obviously it will depend on what happens to
right.
average
So you've got
earnings.
Labour saying £10 an hour, a nice fat round sum, and you've got the Conservatives saying we're not quite sure, it depends on the median average raise and the rate at which it goes up. I mean, that's a fairly stark choice if you're looking at workers' rights.
Well, except that what we're doing with that and with the other parts of this proposal are making a practical set of proposals. Clearly, you have to balance the national living wage, as we do, both in terms of making sure people are paid a fair amount and making sure that the jobs are available for them to do, that you're not pricing them out of the jobs market. We have been spectacularly successful at getting people into work. We've created the best part of 3 million extra jobs. We've got more people in employment than ever before, more women in employment than ever before, falling youth unemployment. We don't want to put that at risk, but at the same time, we do want to have a national living wage that enables people to live decently. That's what we're achieving.
Now, another Labour commitment is maximum pay ratios, 20-1 in the public sector or anyone tending for public sector work. Would you stick to that kind of pay ratio?
I think having arbitrary pay ratios like that probably isn't the best way to help workers. I think the proposal.
But it sends out a signal, doesn't it? It sends out a signal that you know that the people at the top can't carry on getting inordinate amounts more money than the people at the bottom.
Yeah, but sending out a signal is what governments in the past have done too often. What we are proposing is a practical package of measures that will make a difference to people in their real lives. The ability to take time off to train, the ability to take time off to be a carer, the knowledge that because we're giving extra powers to the pensions regulator, that your workplace pension will be better protected in future. That is what will make a difference to people in their daily lives, rather than arbitrary pay ratios.
So you get a year off to look after somebody unpaid. You're giving people a year of unpaid leave.
Well, the opportunity to that, we've looked at this.
What happens if you can't afford it?
We've looked at the system in Ireland, where this system works perfectly well, and most people don't take the full year. It's often a much shorter period than that while you sort out new arrangements.
But if you're a low-paid worker and somebody's offering you a year to look after your elderly parent without money, that's not such a bargain.
Well, different people will have individual circumstances in their families.
But this is about workers' rights, isn't it?
How much time? Yes, and the right to be able to say, look, something has happened in my family. I need to take a couple of months off before I can sort out a new situation, and knowing that your job is guaranteed at the end of that, that removes a significant amount of stress from people, perhaps particularly at a difficult time of their lives. That is a proper, practical extra workers' right.
OK, let's look at a very practical example of workers' rights here. Uber is trying to renew its licence next month. Is a Tory government going to insist that it improve its workers' rights before that licence be guaranteed?
Well, I don't want to talk about individual companies.
Why
because
not?
I think that's unfair, because we're looking at, we've set up quite deliberately in this area of what we all now call the gig economy, where Uber drivers and deliverers.
You
and so
know
on,
very
all
well,
those
Uber
sorts
was
of
taken to
people.
court. It was found
Yeah.
wanting in terms of its care for its workers. So you could say, we are the party of workers' rights. We will not guarantee a new licence for Uber until it changes the way it deals with its workers.
Well, I think making laws to deal with individual companies is often a way to make bad laws. So let's look at the whole sector. And that's what we're doing. We've set Matthew Taylor to do a report precisely on those sorts of jobs.
When Labour says we want to intervene in the market and look at rail nationalisation, you call them socialist or Marxist or back to the 70s. But, you know, when the Tories suggest intervention in, you know, the energy sector, it's somehow standing up for workers' rights.
Well, I don't call Labour socialist or Marxist. They call themselves socialist, or in John McDonnell's case, Marxist.
Your party has been guilty of that.
They're not proposing intervention. They're proposing renationalisation of rail,
of markets
energy.
that don't work.
Well, yes, but what they want to do is have it run by a state monopoly, and everyone over a certain age can remember what happened.
So 2 years ago, it would have been crazy to intervene in the energy sector when it was Ed Miliband's desire or suggestion, and now it's absolutely right because it's Theresa May's and it's a Tory policy. That's what people have a problem with. They don't understand where you stand on this.
It's a different policy. I mean, Ed Miliband's policy
it's about
was
intervening
for
to
a
make
freeze,
energy markets
which he
more fair.
but his actual policy was particularly daft because he said he was going to freeze prices just before the oil price fell, which actually reduced prices. So Ed Miliband's freeze would have kept prices artificially high. We're saying it's a cap on certain types of tariffs if companies are not treating their customers properly.
Damien Green, thank you.
Thank you.
In the last few minutes, it's been announced that the Moors murderer Ian Brady's died. Brady and his then-girlfriend Myra Hindley sexually tortured and murdered 5 children between 1963 and 1965. The couple buried at least 4 of the bodies on Saddleworth Moor near Oldham. Brady died at Ashworth Psychiatric Hospital on Merseyside. He takes to his grave the location of one of his victims, 12-year-old Keith Bennett, has never been found despite desperate pleas from the boy's relatives for Brady to reveal his burial site. Well, we're joined now by the former police officer Norman Brennan, who represents the victims. This has just broken in the last few minutes, Norman Brennan, so give us your first thoughts.
Well, my first thoughts are that these 2 individuals, Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, they murdered 5 young children, one of whom was Leslie Ann Downey, whose family I've represented for many years. And when they murdered her, she was only 10 years of age. She was lost on the moors, and they recorded what they actually did to her. I remember staying with Anne West and Alan, her mother and father, a number of times, and I met them dozens of times. And the grief and torment that I saw in their faces was beyond probably many that I'd actually met. I've met hundreds of families that had somebody murdered, and it's always dreadful. There's never a nice way for anyone to be murdered. But to know that your daughter was lost, alone, and murdered, and then actually her death was recorded, the grief can never, ever be etched from your mind. And those 2 individuals, Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, they didn't just destroy 5 young children's lives. For their relentless appeals and false hopes that they gave the families for over 50 years destroyed all of the families as well, even to this day.
He never released the burial site of Keith Bennett, and that family never recovered. Keith's mum went to her grave tormented in the way that you describe, having begged him many times. Do you understand that mentality?
Well, they both had serious psychological issues, and they then played mind games with the media. And as you rightly say, Keith Bennett did. I remember Winnie and I met the other families as well. And when you saw them on the television, you could only imagine the torment. You know, when we get up and we've had bad days, we hope the next day will be better. Well, when you've had somebody murdered, certainly in the circumstances that Myra Hindley and Ian Brady murdered them, that is torture that exists 24/7, and you can never comprehend it. I sometimes try to comprehend how these families exist, and when I look in their faces, I just see an emptiness. And with every murder, time stops and life changes. And for all the victims of Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, life changed forever. They had a life sentence for over 50 years. And today, I don't know if it's going to bring closure to anybody, because sadly many of the families, actual parents have died too.
Norman, you raise a really interesting point when you talk about psychological issues, because this case caused something of a sort of complication in the public mind, this idea of mental ill health versus pure evil. There were people who said they weren't mentally ill, this was just pure evil.
You're right. You're absolutely right there. I've described Myra Hindley and Ian Brady of two of the most evil people I've ever met, and they are evil beyond belief. And maybe the pair of them tried to fool the prison authorities with their mind games by playing mind games about, you know, their state of mind at the time that they actually committed those murders. And not everybody that commits a murder is psychiatrically ill. And probably they weren't psychiatrically ill, but they tried to convince us. And every time they tried to convince us, it just twisted that knife in the wounds of all of those families a little more. And many of them, as I say now, have died with no peace. I remember seeing Leslie Ann Downey's mother, Anne, in her coffin. And I remember looking at her body, and I looked at her face. And even in death, I saw torment on her face. And I've seen many dead bodies as a police officer, and I'll never forget that face. And I just hope that there's some respite for the families that are still alive today that have lived with over 50 years of grief and pure torment.
Norman Brennan, thank you for sharing your time with us this evening. Appreciate that. We're going to return now to the election news. We've heard about One Nation conservatism as a modern concept for the best part of, what, perhaps a decade. But what does that mantle mean, and can anyone wear it? Here's Nick Watt again.
Two nations, between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts and feelings as if they were dwellers in different zones or inhabitants of different planets.
Sounds familiar? A century and a half after Benjamin Disraeli's searing description of a nation divided by poverty, Theresa May is casting herself as the true guardian of his unifying One Nation credo.
Hello, surprise. Lovely to see you.
In the Prime Minister's mind, today's announcement of new workers' rights delivered on her pledge to unite the nation after the referendum. Theresa May believes that Brexit marked a cry from people who feel left behind by globalisation. She wants to show how the economy can work for all and scoop up Labour votes.
I think we could see the Conservative Party return as the One Nation party geographically. I'm not so sure ideologically, but geographically, certainly. I mean, they look set to pick up seats in the Midlands, even some seats in the North. They may even make some sort of comeback in Scotland, and they will pick up some seats in Wales. And if you think about the way that they stole seats from the Liberal Democrats back last time, then that really is a party that can claim, probably for the first time, at least since the 1980s and probably really since the 1950s, to represent the whole of the country.
But electoral success then, and possibly next month, was not just about geography.
It won't necessarily mean that there's a long-term build for the Tory party, but on this occasion, I think it's likely that Theresa May and the Conservative Party will pull together a combination of people, almost in the way that Reagan did in the United States, pulling people who were traditionally Democrat, traditionally Labour, via UKIP, into the Tory column.
Winning wide support would free Theresa May to govern according to her vision of Benjamin Disraeli's One Nation. Mayism will have some echoes of the right. She reached out to UKIP voters by criticising the global elite as citizens of nowhere. But recent guardians of the One Nation flame on the Tory left will welcome today's pledges on workers' rights. The Prime Minister's own philosopher king, Nick Timothy, who crafted Mayism, was inspired by one of the great municipal figures, Joe Chamberlain.
Joe Chamberlain is actually the right inspiration for this. He was very clear when he became mayor of Birmingham, and indeed what he then went on to do in national politics, that he believed in a vibrant industrial-based economy to improve, in his words, not mine, the conditions of the masses.
See you. Thank you very much.
To many Conservatives, the new West Midlands Metro Mayor provides the template for how to reach out beyond Tory comfort zones.
The tradition of one nation conservatism, of course, is a real fervent belief that the public services must be first class, have to be well funded, and in that sense, I think that is exactly what success in the economic policies, the industrial policy, that is what that enables to happen.
The return of Conservative opponents naturally take issue with the idea of a new era of one nation politics.
It's very difficult to sustain the argument that a Theresa May government on June the 9th, elected by millions of UKIP voters advocating fox hunting and selective education and hard Brexit, is somehow representative of the rebirth of one nation conservatism.
But veteran Tories do see an historic opportunity to reclaim the mantle of Disraeli. May's personality, or the cult of no personality, according to one unnamed catty Tory over the weekend, lies at the heart of this appeal.
I think that one of the reasons why Theresa May is in such a strong position is, first, there is a distinct revulsion against the type of politician that Tony Blair and David Cameron were. They wanted a person that was rather ordinary, who could speak an ordinary language to them and seemed concerned about their lot and their position. And she certainly does that. And she's going to try, when she's been re-elected, try, in fact, to really help ordinary working families.
Mrs Thatcher could argue she was a one-nation Tory. Certainly John Major was, David Cameron and so on. All of their different, the classless society, the big society. Mrs Thatcher created a property-owning democracy. These were all passionate campaigns. But I'm sure for Theresa May, she's always described herself as a one-nation Tory. She's serious, she's sober, she's an evidence-based geography, rather in the way that Mrs Thatcher was a scientist, wanted the evidence.
It's not a belief-driven support for Theresa May. It's a support for her in aspects of a sense of competence and belief that government will probably be at its best with her rather than with other people.
UKIP voters appear to be flocking to Theresa May, who is winning over the Purple Army.
You have a really very remarkable thing going on under our nose right now during this election campaign, which is the creation of, in effect, a new party. It is a merger between Theresa May and Nigel Farage. You had 4 million UKIP voters at the last general election, the vast bulk of which, by all accounts, are going to vote for the Conservatives. So you have a new political party. And that new political party is not going to be a one-nation party. It is a new political party formed through the merger of the Conservative Party and a pretty right-wing, and in some cases far right, political movement, UKIP.
I think UKIP has been a pernicious force, I'm afraid. Their social attitudes on many subjects are not ones with which I identify at all. So I hope the result of this election will be to annihilate UKIP, get back to having a Conservative that governs for the nation.
The Tory tide appears to be flowing across Britain. If Theresa May succeeds, will the British people have invested their hopes in a new Disraeli, or simply place their trust in a safe pair of hands in turbulent times?
Well, that was Nick Watt, and Nick's still here. News from other parties now. Nick, you've been hearing stuff from the Lib Dems today.
Yes, well, I was interviewing Nick Clegg for that film about the Conservatives and the One Nation history, and there's been a lot of speculation about whether a new centre-left pro-European party might be formed after the general election if the polls are right and Labour suffers a very heavy defeat. And in that interview, Nick Clegg gave me a pretty strong hint that he's thinking very seriously about even more cooperation amongst those pro-Europeans. This is what he told me.
It is clear that centre-ground, moderate, internationalist, economically credible, socially progressive voters in the United Kingdom are casting about at the moment for a new home or new homes.
Bring back Tony?
No, I don't think you can reheat old coffee in politics generally. But I equally don't think that vacuums in British politics remain unfilled for very long.
The Labour manifesto tomorrow, Nick, in full. What more do we know?
Yes, well, the BBC is reporting tonight that Labour will pledge to nationalise the water industry if elected, and that would reverse the privatisation of 1989. So, big headlines on the manifesto tomorrow, but I do sense a certain frustration in Labour High Command that their thunder was stolen last week with the leak of that draft manifesto, and that means that they know the focus tomorrow will be on the costing. So, John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, will publish a full paper, we are told, explaining how they will pay for it, and he will say that 95% of taxpayers will not have to pay any more, but the small number earning over £80,000 will have to pay, we are told, a small amount more. And what that means is that we will see an increase for them, but it won't be going up to the sort of 60% rate.
And we'll hit the airwaves, we hope. Nick, thanks very much indeed. More than 1/3 of the NHS trusts that were hit by Friday's cyber attack are still facing problems. Around 200,000 computers in 150 countries were infected with ransomware, a virus which locks and threatens to delete within a certain time unless that ransom's paid. Beyond the cyber criminals, though, who is to blame for the vulnerability of the NHS IT system? Chris Cook, our policy editor, has a look.
Everything in the modern NHS, from scanners to bed management, is held together by computing. So it was a big deal when 48 English hospital trusts and 11 Scottish health boards were hit last week by a ransomware attack. Today, patients were still being diverted in 2 English hospitals. Who then is responsible for the problems in England?
For about a decade, up to 2011, there was actually a programme to standardise all NHS IT, a massive national project run from here in Whitehall. But frankly, it didn't work. Huge cost overruns ran through the whole programme. And so, in 2011, the coalition passed responsibility for hospital IT down to the hospital managers.
This transfer of responsibility might have been smoother, but it came when money was really tight on the front line.
It's not that hospitals don't care about the security of their IT systems, and all of them understand that IT is a vital tool to delivery of healthcare in the modern age. The problem is that the demands on the capital budget are enormous. There's a £5 billion backlog of maintenance for the NHS, and the IT budget has got to provide things like imaging equipment that make sure that cancer patients can be diagnosed. These are urgent and important demands on a very small budget.
Hospitals have been coping by squeezing equipment spending. In 2013-14, the first year for which we have good data, English trusts spent £640 million on equipment. In 2015-16, they spent just £385 million, a 40% reduction.
I think what we need to realise is we're asking, for example, our hospital chief executives to run businesses that has got as much turnover and as many staff as a FTSE 250 PLC. We're effectively asking them to run very complex estates, very complex IT infrastructure, as well as managing, high degrees of kind of clinical risk.
Part of the issue was that some hospitals were insecure because their computers used an old version of Microsoft Windows, Windows XP. Lots of hospitals, under pressure from government and elsewhere, have been trying to sort that out. An NHS England source has told Newsnight that, in December 2015, 18% of NHS computers were running Windows XP. Now, it's just 4.7%, and a load of those are hard to replace. For example, because they're integrated parts of devices like MRI scanners. So just 18 months ago, about 4 times as many English NHS devices were using Windows XP. The effects of a malware attack, had it happened back then, would have been much, much worse.
Chris Cook there. Well, I'm joined now by Kingsley Manning, who until last year headed up NHS Digital. Nice of you to come in, Kingsley. Is this first and foremost a money problem?
Money's part of the problem, but it's only a relatively small part of the problem. And I disagree with Chris Cook's analysis here. Capital is not the big issue. Increasingly, when you're dealing with software issues like cybersecurity, actually it's revenue spending that's important. It's spending on staff, spending on licenses. Equipment spend is actually relatively unimportant in this particular issue.
So who's to blame then? Because a lot of the blame has been shifted towards the Home Office. We've seen Amber Rudd coming out and explaining this. Was this actually an NHS problem more than anything?
Well, ultimately, it's the fault of the criminals. But what this episode does tell us is about a certain amount of weaknesses within the NHS. We've been preparing for the inevitability of this attack since 2013.
When you say we've been preparing,
NHS
when you
Digital,
were head of digital,
absolutely.
You knew this was coming?
We knew that at some point there would be, and indeed this is not by any means the first cyber attack on the NHS. We have dealt with a number of attacks over the last 18 months, 2 years, and they've been dealt with very successfully.
So you can put hand on heart and say, I prepared for this, I did as much as was in my remit to stop this, or?
I always think we potentially could have done more, and I think there are weaknesses which we can talk about. But the notion we were unprepared, I think, is wrong. I agree with the Secretary of State. We set up CareCert, which is the body in Leeds run by NHS Digital, where colleagues this evening are working flat out to resolve the problems. And indeed, the Secretary of State is correct in suggesting that the response has been very good.
Is cybercrime always going to be a step ahead? I mean, is there something to be said for them assuming once your software can cope with X, then they just go on to Y?
I'm advised by the experts on this that it's a battle that will go on and on. It's always one step ahead. If you're lucky, one step ahead against the criminal and the terrorist.
So recovery is almost more important, or the stopping of it in its tracks is more important than it never
Well, it's
happening at all.
both. It's preparedness. And it's a cultural change within the NHS. There are weaknesses here that I think this underlies. There's a weakness in that it's extremely difficult to recruit and retain sufficient professional staff within the NHS. It's extremely difficult, has been proven, and Anita makes this point well. Getting trust boards to take this issue seriously has been difficult. They've got many other priorities. I also think there's a question that this episode raises about the role of NHS England, NHS improvement.
But I mean, when you look at XP, and it's been 16 years
Absolutely.
old. I mean, that's too long, isn't it?
It's too long, but it's for many organisations in the NHS, it's always a delayable decision. We can put it off to next year.
Because we hate spending money on preventative.
We hate spending money, and ultimately, IT, although now it increasingly is at the core, the heart of modern healthcare, it is not necessarily well understood, and has been.
Is that for us culturally? I mean, is it to do with health as a culture?
I think so we've had some real problems. We've in the NHS in the perception of IT. Chris Cook refers to the National Programme for IT, which delivered some really good things, but it also delivered a perception of failure, which was wrong, but that's remained. In the last few years, we've had the debacle over care.data, the release of data from GP systems. So there's an inherent suspicion, if you like. And if you give a board or clinicians a preference about where they spend their money, their time and effort, and as been made point, much of this is about individual professionals taking this issue seriously as much as anything else.
There's a line that's dropped tonight that North Korea could be behind this. Does that ring true to you?
Oh, I've heard various rumours, and you can name anybody east of Berlin and as possibilities.
Kingsley Manning, thank you. The capital appears to have seen a sharp rise in knife crime. 13 people stabbed to death in just over 3 weeks. Of those deaths, one victim in his 30s, one in his 40s, and one in his 60s, but the rest are all young, under the age of 26. The youngest two victims was 17. Data released last week from 32 police forces revealed 2,500 weapons were seized at schools between April 2015 and the beginning of this year, including axes, air guns and nearly 500 knives. So what's happening and why now, when it seemed that there was progress on tackling this kind of crime? We're joined by Dr. Marion Fitzgerald, Professor of Criminology at the University of Kent, and Sheldon Thomas, the founder and chief executive of Gangsline, which aims to prevent gang violence. Very nice to have you both here. And Dr. Fitzgerald, what's actually happening? Are these stats robust enough to say this is a sharp rise in knife crime now?
Well, you have to understand about the stats that what we do is to count the number of times that an officer who records a substantive offence of violence, usually, remembers to put a tick in the box saying a knife was involved. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, and sometimes there's more pressure on them to remember to put the tick in the box than others.
More pressure on them how?
Well, knife crime becomes a crisis, or when forces are looking to claim that they've got a major problem of knife crime and therefore need new resources.
Wait, so they might be ticking the box as a cry for help, saying, come in and help us with more money, or...?
Well, it's hit and miss whether officers remember to do it. They do it more with gun crime, I think, because gun crime is far less common and far more serious. So I think there's more consistency over putting a flag in a box where a gun is used. Knife crime, there's far more of it. And this sort of hit and missness, if their bosses are on their back saying, you must make sure you do it, they're more likely to do it. And then when the pressure is off, sometimes, well, you know, was it really used? Was it really a knife? Some officers will go one way about ticking the box, some will go another way.
Sheldon.
So, you know, the stats we have to be a bit careful of, but I do think there is an underlying problem, and I think I know some of the factors involved, but they're different in the Met from what they are in other forces.
Sheldon, to you, how would you explain it? You've been in gangs, you talk about gangs, you know how they operate. Is that at the heart of this, or are we missing something absolutely major by talking about gangs?
Not really. I mean, first we have to acknowledge how stats work. They only go by, as Dr. Fitzgerald said, by actual police counting figures. A lot of young men do not go to the hospital who get stabbed. So the figures are going to most probably be a lot higher. So we are at crisis point in not just the capital, throughout this country in terms of knife crime. Is gangs at the centre of it all? Well, they were to begin with, and I would say at the moment it's become a culture. And I think that's what people don't understand. It's not only a culture amongst young people to carry knives. It's like...
What do you mean by that? I mean, how many kids do you know... How many kids in London, for example, would carry a knife each time they left the house?
Well, I couldn't put a figure on it, but I would say a lot of the kids growing up in particular areas, in particular deprived areas, would definitely carry a knife out of fear. Of not
during the daytime?
Well, yeah, because it's fear of not wanting to be a part of the gang, so they carry it in case they get bullied or intimidated. And the other part will be, it's become a culture because of the music they listen to. A lot of these guys are listening to music that promote that lifestyle, promote this kind of gangster image. And so it's about, I've got my knife, I've got my weed or drugs, and that's part of their lifestyle.
How much do you think stop and search has played a part in this, either negative or positive?
Well, I think Sheldon's made a very important point about... I mean, the first thing we've got to do is to take young people's fears seriously, because young people generally have been demonised in this, and a lot of kids in very serious violent areas, and a lot of the violence going on between adults, guns going off and so on. There is a hard core of young people, and they know who they are, that they are very, very frightened of. And I've had very experienced police officers saying to me, don't tell them that they're safer to go out there into those streets, in those sorts of areas, without anything to protect themselves, because they will laugh at you. They're far more scared of being found by that hardcore of young people who won't scruple.
So are the police officers saying that they should be carrying weapons?
No, they're not. But we need to understand that, as one officer said to me, they're far more frightened of that hardcore of seriously violent people, be they adults or other children, who would stop at nothing if they have nothing to protect themselves.
The danger of this,
and they're more scared of them than they are of getting nicked by the old bill. That's what one of them said to me.
But this is a normalisation of something that is inconceivable. And if we're now talking about the numbers...
It's inconceivable for middle classes. I'm sorry.
Is it rising or is it not?
No, it is rising. There's no dispute about the rising. What we're discussing here is why are young people carrying knives? And we have to discuss the fear. We have to discuss social factors. We have to look at these guys who carry weapons are more scared of the gang members or more scared of people who are very violent and very confrontational than they are of the law. And this idea of going around telling people don't carry a knife, don't carry a gun is ludicrous, because we don't live where they live. Can you imagine growing up on an estate where 70% of the people on that estate have no father figures, mass unemployment, mums are struggling, kids are growing up and there's gangs everywhere. These are the lives. And these kids, some of these kids, to get to school, has to take 6 or 7 buses round to get to a school just to avoid maybe a gang member or maybe a young person. We've got to understand the lives they are in. They're in a parallel universe that doesn't run along our side.
And you've got to understand you've got a hardcore of people that you really need to target, instead of taking a scattergun approach to all young people who are frightened and trying to protect themselves, their little brothers and sisters and their mums. And unless you bring them on side and take out the people they're frightened of, you're not going to get anywhere.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, elections come and go. Even we know that. But sometimes they're defined by an image. Neil Kinnock on the beach, perhaps. John Prescott punching a voter. John Major on his soapbox. For election 2017, there's one image that will stay with you long after the adrenaline of the campaign has faded. Chris Cook's massive graph. He's got an update on the data, the Tory-Labour battleground seats that's taking the nation by storm. I hand you over to him now, Chris.
So the first thing I'm going to show you is a graph that basically maps out all of the Tory Labour seats, and you can see them all here. This is a bit like a swingometer, and what it tells you is how many seats each party gets. So if there's a swing towards Labour, they'll pick up seats over here. If there's a swing towards the Tories, they'll pick up seats down here. We can actually draw in an estimate produced by Dr. Chris Hanratty that shows the current state of the polling, and what it looks like is, at the moment, the likeliest sort of outcome is for quite big Tory gains. We're talking about 70 or so Labour seats flipping to the Conservatives.
So the dark is solid.
So these are current Tory seats. These are seats that they're going to take. Those are remaining Labour seats. And this dark blue zone over here, you can think of that as like the front line of this battle. Those are the seats where the Tories think they can flip them to them. These seats here are very important. So if we draw in where Theresa May has been on visits, these are the black squares here, you can see there's one over here to Maidenhead, that's her own seat. There are a few over here to a couple of quite UKIP Labour seats, which are very safe.
So she's not really thinking she's going to get these?
Well, she might, because they're quite odd seats, because they've got very large numbers of UKIP voters. But almost all of her visits are in this corridor here. So you can see that she's really honed in on this battleground area. And that's
so the next 2 weeks will be up here, will it? Pretty much, you think?
Possibly. Yeah. I mean, if they think that they're doing better than they were before, they'll push out their visits this way. If they think they're doing worse, they'll pull in. But it's absolutely clear they're in that battleground. If we draw in Jeremy Corbyn's visits, they're quite different. So Jeremy Corbyn's going to a lot of very safe Labour seats over here, and he's going to a lot of some marginal, but some quite safe Tory seats over here. He's not really going to this area at all. And actually, one of the slightly odd things is it looks like Jeremy Corbyn is effectively fighting a campaign that implies Labour's going to pick up seats, while Theresa May is fighting a campaign that implies the Tories will pick up seats, and we're only going to find out who's right in early June.
Can't wait. Chris, thank you very much. Well, that is all we have time for tonight. Kirsty's here tomorrow. Till then, have a very good night. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, most of us saw rain at some stage today, and we're not finished with the wet weather this week yet. In Scotland and Northern Ireland tomorrow we will start dry but see some outbreaks of rain move from west to east, and this band of rain slips a little bit further southeastwards across England and Wales. Behind the